And now I would like to introduce our speakers, Ron Ritchhard and Mark Church, co-authors of a new book, The Power of Making Learning Visible, together. So Ron and Mark, thank you both so much for being here.
Thank you, Gina.
My pleasure.
So I wonder, maybe we could just start off with a little reflection on this new book. So you two were co-authors along with our colleague Karen Morrison on the original Making Thinking Visible book in 2011, so about a decade ago now. And I wonder if you could just share with us a little bit about this new book and what inspired you to write it.
Yeah, well, of course, with all of our research at Project Zero, we are continuing to learn, we're continuing to grow. And one of the new projects that Mark and I are both working on, it's called the Learning to Think, Thinking to Learn project in Santa Fe, New Mexico, funded by the Hankins Foundation. And so as part of that, we were looking at and examining kind of the research around thinking routines and trying to learn more about that. So we were kind of taking our thinking forward into, what ways are teachers using thinking routines? How do they use them most effectively? And we're just beginning to feel like we had a lot more to share there.
Yeah, at one point we were thinking, is this a revised version of the first book, or, just an updated sort of copy? But the more that, like Ron was saying, the more that we've been working with schools in so many places and really watched how teachers were making these ideas their own. I mean, the context, whether it's, government-funded schools in Glasgow, Scotland, or independent schools in Sydney or elsewhere in Australia, public schools right here in the US. The teaching context being very, very different for people, but watching how people really take a stance towards making thinking visible and getting some real power from that. Yeah. We just learned a lot. And we always approach our writing with, how can we capture people's experiences? Because the stories that are unfolding in front of our eyes, I think, are worth sharing out there. And so that was a real, I think, inspiration when you should say, Ron, of this book.
Yeah. And at the same time that was going on, of course, we were developing new routines, and people were asking us, well, where can I read about that? Where is information about that? And so eventually we did feel like we had enough routines. In fact, we had more than enough routines. We had to begin to kind of cull those down in terms of writing about those. But to kind of piggyback again on what Mark just said, that we didn't want this just to be a volume 2. Here are some more routines. We really felt like we had some new things to say about the use of routines as well.
So I wonder if we could just hold on that idea of the thinking routines for a minute, because they are wildly popular. I mean, everywhere in the world I travel, people are already using them. They may or may not have had direct contact with either of you or those of us at Project Zero. And I wonder if you could say a little bit about what makes a good thinking routine, or what makes the difference between, say, an activity or a good set of questions and a thinking routine, and where do you get the ideas from for thinking routines?
Well, first and foremost, really, it is that component of thinking. So there has to have that thinking component. And perhaps, a good example of this, some of the routines that we have written about are ones, that we've adapted, that we've seen how they used more powerfully. And a good example of that adaptation was a routine that we came across called Give One, Get One. And as near as we could find, that routine, first thing I'd find written about it was way back in 1989. But the routine was really just a sharing routine. Students got up, they gave an idea to a peer, they got an idea, they wrote that down. And we thought, well, there's the potential here to really make this a thinking routine if we add in a thinking component. And so 2 things that we felt were really kind of crucial and that could really add to that was, okay, when students give an idea, if they really explain that idea, if they explain what was important about it, if the teacher has some structures that here's what you need to explain about that. And we know, from learning research, that the process of giving explanations is one of the things that helps to build understanding, helps to solidify knowledge. And then another component that we made sure we built into that routine was that it just wasn't this very quick exchange of ideas, but there was a real listening component to that as well. And so that as students are listening to, their peer, they are also hearing, well, how might I add to their list of ideas? How might I advance their understanding? So really beginning to build in those components so that students are actually doing something with the content. And so that's what we really look at and say, well, what are students doing with the content and how is that advancing their learning? That's a really kind of key component that we look at, I think. Mark, what would you add to that?
Well, one of the things that I like to draw people's attention to and is this idea that, as long as teachers have been in classrooms with students, they've put routines in place because there's certain behaviors that they want kids to get good at, right? So the idea of routines in the classroom is not new. Teachers put housekeeping routines in place because there's certain housekeeping behaviors that they just want to happen on demand, right? With finesse and ease. They put management routines in places where certain things need to get managed. This is where we upload things on the Google Drive. This is where the folder is, right? And they practice it once, they practice it twice, and then that just becomes what they do, right? The teacher wasn't looking for a clever activity there. They were looking to grow a pattern of behavior. I want my kids to be able to make this move seamlessly, dare I say, routinely. So that's another thing that I just like to draw everyone's attention to. The idea of routines isn't new. What might be new is really noticing and naming thinking moves. If I want my kids to get good at, let's say, looking at things from different points of view, well, are there some tools and structures I can put in place so that becomes a pattern of behavior? Yeah. And so that was something that's also really important for us that kind of sets thinking routines apart from just an activity to, let's say, jazz up a lesson plan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. I'm just spotting a question coming across the Q&A bar here. Someone says, this is my first year as a teacher, and I wonder what are the thinking routines that are more appropriate to start with if you don't have a lot of experience teaching. So I wonder if you all either want to share specific routines or go through the process of thinking, how would you think about employing a thinking routine if you were really brand new to this?
Well, in the new book, we really have tried to help kind of support that decision-making process for people and really, kind of explain what kind of goes in. But it really, whether you're a new teacher or whether you're an experienced teacher, it does begin with, well, what is the thinking that I need students to do with this particular content? What do I want them to, there's, perhaps in a even stereotypical sense, teachers have traditionally thought about, here's the content, I need to deliver that content. And I often say that learning doesn't occur through the delivery of content. Learning only occurs when the learner does something with that content. So it's not that we ignore content in any way, because content is incredibly important, but we have to think about, well, what is the thinking I want my students to be doing with this content? And so that process really begins to make that perhaps a bit more manageable for a new teacher so that they're not feeling overwhelmed. They could begin the process by thinking about, well, this subject I teach, this grade level I teach, here are 2 or 3 kind of thinking moves that are really important. And I think we've got the understanding map. We might put up the understanding map as a slide, and that might be a good kind of reference point at this point. So as a beginning teacher, to perhaps pick 1 or 2 kind of thinking moves and then look at routines that support those so that they get comfortable with a few routines around a few key areas of thinking. That might be one nice way to start. What would you add on there, Mark?
Well, I think, as a first-year teacher, that, look, the only thing that maybe the rest of us have that you don't is just some years under our belt, right? But it's not like we have some access into some kind of secret of the universe that you're not able to do. So I just want to acknowledge that, right? So it is, be biased towards taking some actions. That's always a good thing, right? And be willing to learn from those actions. I just want to say a small story. I was thinking about my first year teaching, and I was teaching fourth grade in my hometown where I grew up. And I just remember it was the opening days of school. I thought I knew everything about everything. I just remember when the last bell rang and my fourth graders just stampeded the door. And I really felt like I was going to get trampled in my own classroom. And I thought, well, boy, that was a mess. There's no way I want that behavior to happen every single day for the rest of the school year. So what did I do? I started putting a system in place for how we end the day. Things go back in the buckets back in the cubbies, then we line up. Look, we practiced it once, we practiced it twice. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't automatic the next few days, but I stuck with it. Why? Because it was a behavior I wanted my kids to get good at, right? That goes back to like a housekeeping or a management routine. So for new teachers, for any of us on this call, what behavior do I really want my students to get good at? What thinking behavior do I want them to just feel so familiar with? That's the place to get started. Then you can start exploring the routines that were designed to really bring that sort of thinking to the foreground.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. Let's just pause, and I'm going to check with our tech team. Could we get the slide of the understanding map posted here? Is that possible? I think this is a tool that many of us have found very, very useful in thinking through, which routines to use, what kind of thinking do we want our students to use. There it is. Ron, do you want to say a little bit more about this map?
Yeah, so we developed this map and have revised it kind of over the years. We did kind of write about these thinking moves in the original Making Thinking Visible. What we didn't include in the first book was we didn't include a physical map that people could actually use. And what we have found in terms of just some tips as well, we have found it is incredibly useful for teachers to post this map in their classroom, or some versions. There are lots of different versions of this map. On my website, I've got the map translated into about 10 different languages. People can just download those as possibilities. But we tried to identify, when we thought about the issue of developing understanding, what are the thinking moves that learners need to kind of go through to actually understand this material. So the idea of making connections, I mentioned building explanations in there, kind of looking closely and observing, looking at different viewpoints, wondering and asking questions. So we felt that all of these were really important. So as we are planning our units to think about, well, what kind of thinking within this particular lesson with this content, once we've identified the kind of thinking, then we can look at the routines and pick a routine that best matches that kind of thinking. And to make that process a little bit easier, I believe it's on page 33 in the new book. There's a matrix of all of the routines, and there's a column in there that lists the thinking that is involved in that routine. So you can very quickly access all of the routines and look at that and make that connection there.
Yeah. Great. So what I really hear you leaning on is this idea of what's the purpose here? What ultimately, how do we want students thinking? And then there's some selection and maybe even adaptation in response to that.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could speak a little bit. So there are a whole bunch of our colleagues with us today across the world who have been teaching online for a few months now, many of them, and who may or may not be teaching online next year. I wonder if you've seen some interesting uses of thinking routines in the online learning context that might be interesting to share out with people.
Do you want to start there, Mark?
Well, I'll say a few words for sure, because people have asked that, now that we're kind of in a distant space that none of us were expecting, how do I do this there? I always wonder what the this is. And I don't want to be glib about that, right? It's certainly some challenges, but one of the things that I've been thinking an awful lot about is like when I have a core belief that students generating questions takes the learning deeper. Like their wondering really matters. What do I see and notice? What do I think might be going on there? What is that making me wonder? Like, because their questions drive the learning. That's a principle that I hold on to. That didn't change when I had to take my teaching online. That principle is still here. Kids asking questions and basing the learning from the questions they bring still matters. So therefore, it is the challenge of, in this online learning environment, how do I just live that principle, right? If one's approach to thinking routines or just making thinking visible more broadly is just a set of techniques to implement, then that has been discombobulating for a lot of people. But if it's a stance, if making thinking visible is a goal, then that goal still remains. And so therefore, what kind of thinking moves do I get my students to do routinely when we're face-to-face? Well, what's the version of making those same moves when we're in this space? I think that's where some people have found some grounding within the chaos.
I wonder along these lines, here's a question that I see kind of references to in both Twitter and our Q&A. And also I know I've heard a lot from teachers, which has to do with assessment. How do you evaluate a thinking routine? Should we be grading them? How do I count this in the work that my students are doing? And I wonder if you could say a few words about that kind of nest of puzzles there.
Well, we do think about the thinking routines, and I always say this, that thinking routines actually are formative assessment tools. And for a thinking routine to be used well, or for you to judge the success of a thinking routine, the question that I always use is ask yourself at the end of a thinking routine, what have I learned about my students' thinking? Mm. So that is the formative assessment piece. And so, and again, in the book with each of the routines, we do have a specific section on assessment, but it is focused on the formative assessment. What do you pay attention to? What might you learn? Kind of how might you deal with that in the moment in a responsive act? Because formative assessment is not a task. Formative assessment is a practice. And so we have to hone that practice of how do we pay attention and how do we respond to that. So it is that big kind of formative assessment piece. At the same time, we always emphasize to teachers, you should not be grading a thinking routine. Because once students switch from, this is not about my thinking, this is about what the teacher wants to see, they begin to focus on, what does the teacher want to see? What will get me the good grade? What should I say here? And then you're actually robbed of their thinking. So you want students to kind of recognize when we're using a thinking routine, this is the messy process of learning. You might have misconceptions. You might make mistakes. That's absolutely fine in the messiness of learning. We'll talk about those. We'll learn from those. But if students feel like they're penalized because, I totally didn't understand that, then you are actually diminishing the power of the thinking routines, and you will find that students are no longer giving you their thinking. What is more likely to happen, the way that teachers would use a thinking routine, is they would use a thinking routine, and a good example from the book is the routine peeling the fruit. And an example there is Tom Heilman used that as the messiness of helping his students to understand a poem. All of that messiness. Then after that, students went home and they wrote an analytic essay about the poem. That was what was graded. So the thinking routine serves as a bridge for developing understanding that then produces something more formal that gets graded. And so if you need a grade, think about, well, how do I use this to build students' understanding towards a more traditional product that might be useful?
Yeah, on that note, Ron, something that you were just making me think about, and Tina as well, when teachers or people out in the field ask me, how do I assess a thinking routine? I think a helpful redirect is, when this kind of thinking becomes routine, what can I notice about that which we're assessing? Like those essays should reflect more depth or sophistication. Those investigations should mirror the move of building explanations and uncovering complexities, reasoning with evidence. So rather than assessing the thinking routine, if this thinking became routine, how would this be noticed on the kinds of things that we're trying to pay attention to? So that, I think, maybe goes hand in hand with something that Ron just said there, because people do have to navigate the systems they're in. I also want to say something too, that, you know, when thinking about formative assessment, I know like Laura Fried and Paul Miller are on this call. They were teachers that really worked to like improve the quality of third graders' questions. And so using question sorts, that's one of the new routines that's written of in the book, and their journey is documented there. But, you know, it wasn't like they were trying to grade the kids' questions, but they noticed our kids are probably capable of asking deeper, more meaningful questions. We've got to give them some kind of opportunity and make that a routine part of our practice so that we can bump up the quality of it. So that's by getting their questions out and sorting their questions over time. And they did this over several different units. Then they could start noticing that the quality of the questions got better. So there are things to assess about the qualities of the thinking, for sure. But when it's just, how do I grade this? That's probably not the right question to ask.
So let me just ask if our tech support team could put the slide back. Yes, brilliant. Thank you so much. There it is. So
I think sometimes when people ask me, you know, do you have a good routine for mathematics? Do you have a good routine for early childhood? Do you have a good routine for you know, a topic like the age of exploration in Europe and, you know, the middle of the last millennia, if you will. Anytime people ask me, do you have a good routine for that? It's like, well, we don't really have math routines and social studies routines and kindergarten routines. What we have is thinking routines. So I often draw people back to this map. Is there a certain kind of thinking move that really helps to develop and deepen understanding in your subject matter? Like you, Tina, you just mentioned English language learners or just world language learners, just language learners, I think is what you refer to, right? Well, so when I look at this map here, and I do this with a lot of colleagues, whether it's language acquisition or English as a additional language, well, like I remember talking with one teacher who was teaching beginning French. I asked her once, I said, have you ever worked with students that didn't have any French coming off their tongues at the beginning of the year, but towards the end of the year, boy, they were just speaking lots and lots of French off their tongues. Well, of course I have. Well, it's helpful to think, what kind of thinking moves did those kids routinely bring that help them acquire and transfer that language? A lot of times, you know, they will say things like, well, the kids who can look for connections, making connections, that's there on the screen on the top right kind of corner of that map. You know, a language learner who's not looking at every new thing like it's a brand new thing, but rather they're always saying, well, this one's kind of like this, but what those students were doing is making connections. How might this one work? Maybe even building an explanation there. So it's sometimes helpful to think, well, are there certain kinds of thinking moves that would really develop and deepen understanding well? And that's my advice to get started. Start with the move, the purpose, to just keep on that kind of theme today. And then what practices might I put into place to make that move more routine? And when I talk about making thinking visible practices, I'm not just talking about routines, but I'm also talking, these moves could really influence the kind of questioning I do in the classroom, the documenting I do in the classroom, or we do, better yet to use that pronoun, the listening I do in the classroom. So this map, I think, becomes the real foreground for people.
Yeah.
One kind of new learning for me around the thinking routines, particularly with young children in early childhood, and I think that that's you know, does present challenges when you think about, particularly if you've just seen someone do a routine and you say, well, you know, we did it in writing and the examples you just showed are all writing and my kids can't write and they don't have that. And, you know, so how am I going to use that? And what I've come to kind of realize that can be really useful in using a thinking routine for particularly with young children, and this actually can work at any level, but it works very, very well with young children, is to use the routine as what I call a documentation frame. So that means that you think in your own mind, here's, as Mark just said, what kind of thinking do you want to look for? Or take a routine like, I used to think, now I think. Well, that's normally you sit down and you write that. Students have done a whole unit of instruction. You're looking at that. But I was in a early childhood class in which the teacher and I were really, okay, well, let's look for these shifts in thinking. Where do we see that happening? And then we will use the routine with the students. And so in this particular classroom, we were observing a small group of students in the block corner building with blocks. And they were trying to build, obviously, the tallest tower they could. Things kept falling over, and gradually they kind of started to expand the base to get things taller. And so at that point, the teacher went over to them and talked with them. She said, I've been watching you, and it looks like you used to think you could just stack blocks as tall as you wanted to make a tower. But now it looks like you're thinking that the base is really important. And then she said, are there other things you used to think? Now, by returning to students their own thinking, them seeing exactly how that frame worked, then those students were able to say things like, one student said, I used to think we couldn't use the round block, but now I realize if you put it in between two flat blocks, it won't move. And so the students began to came up with all of those. And then the teacher began that documentation, and they kind of created some documentations about how the thinking had shifted. So that's a good example of how you might use a routine. So it doesn't have to be, we sit down, we do it very formally, we do it with a whole class, we do it in writing. It could be used as that kind of a documentation frame. And as I said, that was an early childhood example, but in a secondary chemistry class, students are doing experiments. The teacher can be walking around, paying attention to what students are doing, paying attention to how they're self-correcting, where do they see shifts in thinking, and then stop the class and say, I've been walking around, I've been watching you. It looks like a lot of you used to think, and now you're thinking, what other things? And so that idea of a documentation frame could be used at any grade.
I would love, I'm just keeping an eye on I've got a couple of more questions here that are coming in bunches, and I want to connect to those before we leave. One of them has to do with our current moment. It says, during a time of social tension, how can we use thinking routines to grow empathy? I wonder if you have thoughts about that.
Well, we've talked a lot about the understanding map, and one particular kind of thinking on there is considering different viewpoints, looking at things from different perspectives. And so that's obviously very much kind of connected to the idea of empathy. And I think one that perhaps people don't think is, or might not immediately think is also so connected, is the idea of uncovering complexity. That when we see the world as black and white, when we see it as easy decisions, as you said at the outset, Tina, we're in the midst of having, huge discussions of about racism, about his historical role, about how it perpetuates, and we recognize that's a very, very complex situation. And so by using routines to help students kind of uncover that complexity, and part of that complexity is being able to kind of recognize there are different perspectives. There are different things that kind of come into that. Those can be incredibly, kind of useful tools. I mean, I just mentioned the story routine, and that story routine of kind of recognizing a lot of times we've been told or we are familiar with the main story. Mm-hmm. We need to broaden our perspective and think about, well, what are the side stories, the people who are not at the center of this, who are also being affected, but then also, what is the hidden story? What are the voices we are not hearing from? And as we get, and you know, that's one of the things that makes history so incredibly engaging, is when we begin to delve into those side stories and those hidden stories, and we begin, and that also helps to connect with those events and develop that sense of empathy. So I think that there are several routines that really are kind of targeted at that. Mark, I know that you've used a couple of those extensively as well that you might want to talk about.
Yeah, well, as Tina said, you know, in light of developing empathy and the current situations we're in, you know, as Ron was just talking, I'm sitting here in my kitchen table and I'm on the brink of turning 50. I turn 50 next week. And I think I've been at this adult gig for a little while now. And I was just thinking, you know what? Most of the questions I've had to handle in my adult life don't have an answer. That's not to say that questions don't have answers. There are questions that have answers, but I just think most of the kind of questions that I have to grapple with day in and day out don't have answers. Even if we think, you know, how do we create communities where everyone feels safe? Well, what's the answer to that? You know, there is no answer to that, but there's certainly perspective. So I think for me, all those thinking moves that we really want to make more visible, valued, actively promoted in our classrooms serve as a foundation for the moves that we need to make long into our adulthood to handle all the unanswerable questions. Specifically, Ron, you were talking about main side hidden, the story routine. I was thinking a lot, especially I read the paper every morning these days, well, online, start my day that way. And I find myself doing the 3 whys. That is a routine that Veronica Points-Marcia and Flossie Chua and some others at Project Zero helped to develop. And we've highlighted it in this book as well. But like, I'm asking myself, why does this matter? Why does this matter to me? I'm just this guy sitting in his kitchen island in Seattle. Why does this matter to me? Why might this matter to those around me, my community? And what in this matters to us as the world? That pattern of thinking, why, the 3 whys, you know, I really do think it's helping me hear more voices, even though the voices aren't here in front of me. I do think it's causing me to care more than fear, but it's complex. And so I do think these thinking moves really are in service of or leverage towards these unanswerable questions. And that's most of the questions that kids will face when they're our age.
Yeah, right. Thank you both so much for those. I wondered, so there are a few questions here about the book itself, and people are wondering, if I haven't read Making Thinking Visible, can I read this one? Should I read that one first? What's your recommendation there if there's somebody who hasn't read either one and they're trying to figure out where to start?
Well, you know, that was something that Ron and I talked about quite a bit when we were kind of formulating like what goes in this book and who's it for and who's the audience. And we felt like we wanted to write it so that those who've been living with these ideas for some time would have some, you know, more things to think about, certainly new routines, but as also some of these other learnings where teachers have really maximized the power of these thinking routines, for example, and other kind of MTV, making thinking visible practices. So we did think about it for the experience, but we were very, very mindful of, you know, someone may pick up this book as their entry point. Will this be accessible enough? And we feel it does that. Certainly the first book makes a case for why even put thinking at the center of the educational enterprise. Certainly if you start Googling visible thinking routines, you're going to see a lot of the routines from that book, because as you mentioned, Tina, it's been out since 2011, but even teachers were making use of thinking routines before that, which allowed for us to write that book. So that would be a good introduction to thinking routines for sure, but don't feel like this second book is inaccessible, because we wrote it with you in mind as well.
Ron and Mark, thank you both so much for being here. Thanks for sharing all of your thoughts and wisdom. Thank you for bringing all of the great practices that you've seen in many, many hundreds of teachers' classrooms to share with the rest of us so that we can learn from that. And I hope we'll get to do this again sometime soon. Thank you both. And thanks